Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. I'm going to call now on Senator Blackburn, who has been, like Senator Hawley, a real leader in this area. She and I have co-sponsored the Kids Online Safety Act, which would provide real relief to parents and children, tools and safeguards they can use to take back control over their lives and more transparency for the algorithms. And then we will turn to Senator Klobuchar, who has been such a steadfast champion on reforming laws involving big tech, her Safe Tech bill, as well as the competition bills that you mentioned, Mr. Sullivan, that I've been very privileged to help her lead on. Senator
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is one of those areas where we have bipartisan agreement. And as the chairman said, I've worked on this issue of safety online for our children for quite a while, and for privacy for consumers when they're online, data security, as they've added more of their transactional life online. And Ms. Bennett, I think I want to come to you on this. When I was in the House and chairman of Comms and Tech there, I passed FOSTA SESTA, and that has been implemented. And we had so much bipartisan support around that, and finally got the language right, and finally got it passed and signed into law. And some of the people that worked with us during that time have come to me recently and have said, hey, the courts are trying to block some of the victims' cases based on 230 language. And Professor, I see you nodding your head also. I would like to hear from you what you see as what they have ascertained to be the problem, how we fix it, if you think there is a fix, or is this just an excuse that you think they're using not to move these cases forward?
Sure. So I actually don't litigate FOSTA SESTA cases. So if was it Professor Franks who was nodding their head? I unfortunately don't know the answer to that for you, but I'd be happy to get it for you and could submit it afterwards.
I would appreciate that.
I'd be very happy
Go
to do
ahead,
that.
Professor.
Yeah, I'm not the lawyer in the room. I'm the computer scientist, but I will say I've seen the same arguments being made. I want to come back to something earlier too, because I think this speaks to your question, Senator, about small platforms. Small platforms have small problems. They don't have big problems. In fact, we have seen in Europe, when we deploy more aggressive legislation, small companies comply quite easily. So I don't actually buy this argument that somehow regulation is going to squash the competition because they don't have big problems. Coming back to your question, Senator Blackburn, we also saw, and I think this is important as we're talking about 230 reform, the same cries of, if you do this, you will destroy the internet. And it wasn't true. And so we can have modest regulation. We can put guardrails on the system and don't destroy the internet. I am seeing, by the way, and I don't know the legal cases, but I am seeing some pushback on enforcing SESTA FOSTA, and I think that's something Congress has to take up.
Well, I think you're right about that. That's probably another thing that we'll need to revisit and update that as we look at children's online privacy and COPPA 2.0. Senator Markey, when we were in the House, led on that effort. And then Senator Blumenthal and I have had the Kids Online Safety Act. Recently, Senator Ossoff and I introduced the Report Act, which would bolster NCMEC. And we think that's important to do. It would allow keeping CSAM info for a longer period of time so that these cases can actually be prosecuted. And it's interesting that one of the things we've heard from some of the platforms is that changes to Section 230 would discourage the platforms from moderating for things like CSAM. And I would be interested from the professor, really from each of you, on the panel, if you believe that reforming 230 would be a disadvantage, that it would make it more difficult to stop CSAM and some of this information, because it's amazing to me that they think changing the law, being more explicit in language, removing some of the ambiguous language in 230 would be an incentive for the platforms to allow more rather than a disincentive. Ms. Franks, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think the clarity that we need here about Section 230 and about this criticism is to say which part of Section 230, because if the objection is that changes to C1, which is really the part of the statute that is being used so expansively, if the argument is that some of those changes would make it harder and would disincentivize companies from taking these kinds of steps, I'd say that's absolutely false. C2 quite clearly and expressly says this is exactly how you get immunity, is by restricting access to objectionable content. So what that means, of course, is that if it's a Section 230 C1 revision, you still have C2 to encourage and to incentivize platforms to do the right thing. That being said, potential attacks on C2 could, in fact, have an effect on whether or not companies are properly incentivized to take down objectionable material. But there is, of course, also the First Amendment that would come into play here, too, because as private companies, these companies have the right to take down, to ignore, to simply not associate with certain types of speech if they so choose.
Okay. Professor, anything to add?
I'll point out a couple of things here. I was part of the team back in 2008 that developed a technology called PhotoDNA that is now used to find and remove child sexual abuse material, CSAM. That was in 2008. That was after 5 years of asking, begging, pleading with the tech companies to do something about the most horrific content, and they didn't. It defies credibility that changes to 230 is going to make them less likely to do this. They came kicking and screaming to do the absolute bare minimum, and they've been dragging their feet for the last 10 years as well. So I agree with Professor Franks. I don't think that this is what the problem is. I think they just don't want to do it because it's not profitable.
Thank you. Ms. Bennett, anything to add?
I will do what everybody should always do, which is agree with Professor Farid and Professor Franks, which is,
Okay.
to the extent we're talking about C1, it shouldn't have any impact if you're keeping the good faith defense for removing content, then that's still there and no changes to C1 should impact that.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan?
While I agree with everything that has just been said, the truth of the matter is that this illustrates why this is such a complicated problem. Because when you open the legislation, the chances that only one little piece of it is going to get changed, not so high. And so the problem that we see is, Section 230 is what gives the platforms the ability to do that kind of moderation. It's what protects them. And therefore, we're concerned about the potential of, for that to change as well.
Professor?
I can't quite agree with everybody. It's gotten a little more complicated, but I think you can reform Section C1 without creating disincentives to remove dangerous material. I think that's sort of a make-weight argument. I think you have to be careful about changes to C2, although I understand that there are issues there. But I just let me bring home a point, I guess it was Professor Farid make. Spending money to remove dangerous material from a website is not a profit center. And I think Elon Musk has explained that to the country in exquisite detail. If there are no financial incentives to avoid harm, you don't make money by doing it. And you've got to change those incentives.
I'm way over, and I thank you for your indulgence.
Thanks a lot, Senator Blackburn. Senator Klobuchar.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to both you, Chair Blumenthal and Senator Hawley, for holding this hearing.